What is the most ridiculous reason you have been taken to court? A few years ago, I was renting a small storefront downtown for my little bakery. It wasn't a huge operation, just me, a part-time helper, and a rotating display of pastries and coffee for the morning crowd. My landlord was an older guy named Frank who owned several buildings in the area. He was gruff, but seemed reasonable enough when I signed the lease. About 6 months in, we had a particularly rainy week. The roof had been leaking since I moved in. Nothing huge, just a slow drip in the storage area. I'd told Frank about it more than once, and he always said he'd get around to it. This time, though, the leak got worse, bad enough that water was pooling on the floor. I put out buckets and moved my dry goods out of the way. One morning, I came in to find the leak had spread. Water had dripped right onto one of the ceiling tiles in the main customer area, and the tile gave way overnight. There was a small mess, nothing catastrophic, but it was obvious the roof was in bad shape. I called Frank again, told him it needed fixing immediately. He grumbled but said he'd send someone soon. 2 weeks went by. No repairs. The buckets were still in place. The leak was still happening. Finally, I decided to withhold a small portion of my rent, about $200, until the roof was fixed. I wrote him a note explaining why and told him I'd pay the balance as soon as the repairs were done. That's when things got weird. Instead of calling me or coming by, Frank filed a claim against me in small claims court. The reason listed was property damage and rent withholding. When I got the notice, I was stunned. Property damage? The roof had been leaking since I moved in. The only damage in the place was from the water coming through his ceiling. On the court date, I showed up with photos, emails, and even text messages showing I'd reported the leak multiple times. I had time-stamped pictures of the buckets, the stained ceiling tiles, and even the food storage area I'd had to rearrange to keep everything safe. I thought it would be an open and shut case. Frank showed up with a folder of papers and a smug look. He told the judge that the water damage was my fault because, according to him, steam from the bakery had risen up and weakened the roof. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing out loud. Steam doesn't travel upward through multiple layers of flooring and roofing and cause rainwater leaks, but he said it with such confidence, like it was a proven scientific fact. He also claimed I'd encouraged the damage by putting buckets down, which he argued collected water and made the problem worse. The judge actually had to stop him and ask him to clarify how catching leaking water was causing more leaking water. Then came the kicker. Frank had brought a single photo as evidence that the roof was fine before I moved in. It was a picture of an entirely different building. You could see the street address in the photo, and it wasn't mine. When I pointed that out, he shrugged and said it must have been mislabeled. The judge gave him a long, unimpressed look. I handed over my folder of evidence, including the written note I'd given him explaining the rent withholding. I also had receipts showing I'd paid full rent every month before the leak worsened. By the end of the hearing, it was pretty clear Frank didn't have a case. The judge ruled in my favor, dismissing his claims entirely, and even suggesting that I could pursue him for failing to maintain the property. Frank didn't say a word as we left the courtroom, just stormed off. I went back to work that afternoon, buckets still in place. 2 days later, a roofing crew showed up unannounced and patched the leak. No apology, no acknowledgement, just silent repairs. The whole thing had been over $200 and a stubborn refusal to admit he'd been neglecting the building. Months later, I heard from another tenant in one of his other properties that he'd tried the same stunt with them over a broken heater. Apparently, taking people to court for nonsense was just part of how he operated. It was the most absurd legal situation I'd ever been in, and the only time I've walked into a courtroom thinking I might have to defend myself over a puddle of rainwater.